In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about costs in more detail. But before you actually talk through the notes on this, I'd like you to actually take a look at Jacob Clifford's YouTube video here on the LRATC. And it's only a really quick little video, but I think he does a nice job of outlining this concept called the LRATC. And this LRATC corresponds to something called the long run average total cost curve. The long run average total cost curve. And take a look at that video, and then we're going to be able to kind of really talk about this. So I'm going to try to put a link into my videos to get you there. Now, assuming that you've seen that video, a couple of things that I wanted to have you in your notes here about that. We're distinguishing the short run from the long run, which we've already learned about in this class. But just remember that in the long run, all of your inputs are variable, so all of your costs are variable. Remember, your fixed inputs are no longer fixed, they're now variable. In the long run, also, because of that, you would have many or infinitely many combinations of fixed inputs and variable inputs. So you could think about maybe a scenario where in scenario, we'll say A, you have 5 units of capital for K and 6 labor. And you could have scenario B where you'd have 4 units of capital and 7 laborers, right? And you could have an infinite number of combinations of labor and capital that you could have, scenario B and scenario C and so forth. It's possible that we graph these theoretical short-run combinations as a short-run ATC. And this is what we've been doing already, done. Right? When we graphed the ATC in the previous video, what we were actually graphing was one of these short-run combinations. We were saying, hey, we exist currently with 6 laborers and 4 units of capital. And we graphed that ATC as basically saying you have 4 units of capital fixed, and then you increased the number of laborers. And so that was still just one combination, right? Basically where you kept the capital the same, but you varied the number of laborers. And we'd say that that exists as like one combination. It's possible for us to actually graph all of these theoretical short-run combinations, the many different combinations that we might have. And at any given point, we would know that firms are operating on one of these specific short-run ATCs, but in enough time in the long run, right? In the long run, they can change the ATC that they're operating on to go to a different one with a different amount of fixed costs. So they could switch from, say, scenario A with 5 units of capital and 6 labor, they could switch to scenario B with 4 capital and 7 labor, or they could do 4 capital and 6 labor, or something along those lines. They could switch to a different scenario or a different short-run ATC. Now, to illustrate the various options, all of these different combinations, we can construct a long-run ATC that illustrates those. So we have a long-run ATC that illustrates all the various options, and the way we do it is we actually plot all of the different ATCs. So, case in point, we're going to do one, and it's going to be kind of crazy looking, quantity of output, right? Quantity of output, and then we're going to say here is the price, or we just say the dollar value, right? The dollar value. Now, you can imagine that if there's a really low quantity of output, and you have maybe scenario A with very few capital and labor combined, you might have up here, right, an ATC curve that's way up here. And the minimum point of that ATC curve is here, and we could say, it has that nice U shape. But we might say that if the company expands, right, they double the amount of inputs, right, and they expand, then they can actually spread out some of those costs, though. And the reason that you might think that starts to happen is they start to spread out the size of the company over more and more quantities of output. And what we're really doing is spreading out our fixed costs. So we'd say, let's open a second factory or a second restaurant location. But when you do that, you don't have to hire a second marketing director, right? You would still have just one marketing director. You would still have just one CEO. You would have just one accountant. You have 2 locations, but you have just one of those kinds of positions. So you spread out some of those costs, but it increases your output. So we'd say you have a second ATC out there that would be a second possibility, and these are short-run ATCs, so I'm going to put SR in front of them, that a second one where the minimum cost point is a little bit lower. And then your company gets a little bit bigger. We'll say they open a third location, SRATC 3, and a fourth location, SRATC 4, and so forth. But at a certain point, you have to hire a second accountant, SRATC 5. And so you start to basically get bigger, but your minimum cost point here at the bottom of these starts to end up flattening out a little bit. And it stays flat for a while, right? That sixth location. But eventually, your company gets a little too big. And your company starts to have the SRATCs go up again, the minimum points start to go up again. And then you have SRATC 8, the eighth location, where the minimum point is way back up here again. And what we're going to do is we're going to connect the bottoms of these. Oops, it'd be nice if I could graph a little bit better. And it's okay if yours is a little rough like mine there, that's all right. We're going to connect the bottom points, and that is an LRATC. And we can imagine that we have infinitely many combinations, right? And I was initially saying you have one location of your restaurant, two locations, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 locations. But imagine that instead, these aren't really locations of the restaurant. These are just infinitely many different combinations of capital, where like as you rise in the number of fixed resources, it changes your SRATC that you're operating on. So you would have a ton of little ones in here too, where these operate, right? There are tons of them operating in here that represent all those different possibilities. And the minimum points, if you linked up all the minimums, is actually where this LRATC comes from. That's where that comes from. Now, there are a few different ranges of this LRATC, and you might be able to tell right here, right, is the first range, and here is the second range. The different ranges are where LRATC shows decreasing costs, and constant, and increasing costs. Now, you have three different phrases to know here. 1, 2, 3. We're actually going to call these economies of scale. And this means that it's actually decreasing your costs because your ATC is decreasing. It's called the economies of scale range because getting bigger, well, allows you to essentially get bigger and have a lower ATC. And that happens because your people start to specialize and you can spread out those setup costs and you can bulk buy. So getting bigger actually lowers your average total cost of producing. Think about it like a specialty producer of artisanal bread, right? Each unit of bread, their average total cost of bread is going to be relatively high because they produce very few of them. But a massive company that makes thousands of loaves of bread a day, each unit of bread is going to be really, really cheap. So the idea being that they've gotten bigger, which reduces the average cost of a loaf of bread. Now, at a certain point of getting bigger, you get what are called constant returns to scale, which means that by doubling the inputs, right, doubling inputs doubles the output. That means that if you double the input, you double the output. So that's another way to kind of think about these, is that one, is that it's constant. So if you double inputs, you double outputs. Now with this one, for this one here, it would be like if you doubled the inputs, you had double the inputs. In this one, you might get 3 times the output is actually another way to say that, right? Because you're actually decreasing the average cost of producing. That's another way to say this. So double the inputs is you get 3 times the output with the economies of scale. With this one called diseconomies, right? Diseconomies is that range. This range is where they get higher ATC by getting bigger, and so if you had 2 times the input, you might only be able to squeeze out 1.5 times more output. So you're putting a lot more in than you're really getting out, and that's because maybe communication and coordination problems. A lot of companies really try to avoid operating in that range Companies that get too big, for example, are like conglomerates, these huge corporations that they have all kinds of different parts to the business that sometimes don't really work together. They don't synergize. So there's a lot of research at company levels to say, like, oh, we want to get bigger, but we definitely don't want to get into this range. So hopefully this helps you understand some of the concepts related to LRATC, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.